Welcome, everybody. So we've been doing texts on Tuesdays for a few months now, and to kind of bring some regularity to it, we started doing a What's That About at the first week of the first Tuesday of every month to explore some new thing. And sometimes it turns into what the rest of the month is about, and sometimes it doesn't. And this one, it will turn into what the rest of the month covers, which is Maimonides. And most of what we'll do the rest of the month is actually look at primarily the Guide of the Perplexed. But it helps to have an overview of Maimonides before you go and do that, so that you know where he's coming from and what he's up to, and just have some biographical background. One of the things that I was once asked in a graduate seminar, not about Maimonides, about St. Augustine, this was an exam question, is Augustine a theological anthropologist or an anthropological theologian? Now, this seems like a ridiculous question, but it actually does matter, in the sense that, sometimes people are sitting in their studies and are producing material and aren't actually terribly connected to the people that they're writing for and about. And sometimes they actually are relatively well connected. And part of what I'm going to suggest to you is that despite the fact that we are told that Maimonides' Guide of the Perplexed is a document for the elite and a document that maybe you would think is abstract theology, Maimonides on the whole, and we'll see this with the Guide of the Perplexed as well, is actually fairly practically minded. So I think he would actually fall on the theological anthropologist end as opposed to the anthropological theologian, right? People come first for him, which gets overshadowed when all you think about is the Aristotelian philosophy of the Guide, which is why we're not talking so much about the Guide, and we are going to talk about his other work tonight. So our basic goals are just an overview of the basic details of his life, which are important for interpreting Maimonides, gaining an understanding of some of how his life and his work combined, and then getting some kind of understanding of Maimonides' approach to Jewish and philosophical issues and how those fed into the controversies about his work over the course of his life. And we won't go deep into the Maimonidean controversies. That's really for the Guide of the Perplexed. So a biographical sketch, this is a pretty long sketch, actually, because his life and his work are tightly intertwined. So he's born in April or May in either 1135 or 1138. There's problems with calculation and all kinds of other things, and there's multiple stories about his birth, and it's not like there's a public health department that just keeps track of birth certificates in 12th century Cordoba, Spain. So you're kind of working from other sources. So Maimonides, I'm probably primarily going to call him Maimonides. Maimonides is a Greek word that just means son of Maimon. So Moshe ben Maimon is his Hebrew name. Maimonides' father, Maimon ben Joseph, was a dayan, so he was a judge. He was a highly placed judge. Maimonides' family claimed to be directly linked to Rabbi Shimon ben Judah HaNasi. So for those of us who were hanging around for the stuff about the Mishnah or about rabbinic literature, you'll maybe remember that Judah HaNasi was the guy who compiled the Mishnah in the year 200 and is just known as rabbi in rabbinic literature, or Maimonides actually calls him Rabbeinu at times, our rabbi. And so his family claimed to be related to Rabbi's son, Rabbi Shimon, which probably means that they were from the mother side of the family. And he's actually said, Maimonides at one point says, there's 38 generations from me to Rabbi Judah HaNasi, and then there's 38 generations between Rabbi Judah HaNasi and creation. So this is a very aggrandized personal biography. So Barry says, when in doubt between science and religion, didn't he choose religion? No. That's a controversial answer, but we'll get back to why I think the answer is no. Known in some circles as Maimonides and in others as Rambam or Ha-Rambam. So Ha-Rambam is the Rambam in Hebrew. Rambam, Rabbi Moshe ben Maimon, right? So R-M-B-M. You get Rambam in Hebrew. The abbreviation gets put together and you just say it as a word. And so you will hear people who are educated in the yeshiva system in the United States just call him the Rambam in English. Which name you use depends on context. In modern scholarly circles, if you walk into a university and you start talking about the Rambam, some people will know what you mean, but they won't really correct you, but they'll think, why are you talking like this? Philosophy professors, I'll call them Maimonides. In broader culture, in the Western canon, all of that stuff, nobody calls them the Rambam. In traditional Jewish settings, Rambam, Ha-Rambam, the Rambam, much more common. I don't know, maybe at Hebrew Union College, they call him Maimonides, but you know, in yeshiva settings in particular, he's Ha-Rambam, he's the Rambam. I will probably switch back and forth, but primarily use Maimonides. So he's born in 1135 or 1138, more or less. Around age 10, they were living under the Almohad dynasty in southern Spain. The Almohad dynasty, a Berber dynasty, so from North Africa, is replaced by the Almoravid dynasty, also from North Africa. And the Almohad dynasty and the Almoravid dynasty differ on what you do with Jews and Christians. Jews and Christians had a status that, if you never heard of it before, is called dhimmi status. And dhimmi status is like second-class citizenship for the people of the book. In traditional Muslim theology, if you are an idolater, you can be forced to convert, or you can be forced to die. Dhimmi status allows you to not face that, and you get second-class citizenship status. You usually have to wear some kind of a marker that you're not Muslim, but you're not really one of these idolaters. You're not entitled to all the same protections, but you are entitled to protection. You may not be able to own property. You might not be able to ride on a horse. There are all kinds of different limitations that come along with being dhimmi, but you don't face direct persecution. When you lose dhimmi status, you face direct persecution. So the Almohads changed to the Almoravids. Things got dangerous for Jews in southern Spain, and Maimonides' family hightails it out of Spain. And they wander for about 10 years, and then they finally get to Morocco. And Morocco was a common destination for Sephardic Jews. So if you look at the history of Moroccan Judaism, which is kind of its own interesting topic, Moroccan Jews identified as Moroccan, Sephardic Jews came into their communities, tended to be better educated, tended to have more money, ended up really leading the communities, and often caused the Moroccan Jews, the kind of native Moroccan Jews, to self-identify as Sephardic over time, which is, you know, an interesting phenomenon in and of itself. So Maimonides and his family end up in Morocco for a while. And it's a productive time for him. So he keeps studying Greek philosophy, traditional Jewish texts, and right around age 30, still in Morocco, he composes a commentary on the Mishnah. So the Mishnah, for people who don't keep all of this terminology in their head, the Mishnah is not really a code of law. It is the first rabbinic document we have, and purports to list various positions on specific areas of Jewish law. It's not comprehensive. It's not authoritative. It doesn't give you an answer. It'll give you 3 answers. These are to be memorized and debated. It's a document kind of constructed for the purpose of memory and interpretation, not so you have the answer. So he composes a commentary on the Mishnah. So he's 30 years old, and he's compiled a commentary on this entire rabbinic document that forms the basis for the Talmud and rabbinic Judaism going forward. And then around 1168 or so, they leave Morocco, travel to Israel for a while, not very long, and then settle in Egypt in a city called Fustat. In Jewish sources, this is often written as Fostat with an O instead of a U. It's about a mile downriver from Cairo, keeping in mind that what we're accustomed to seeing geographically in Egypt is Cairo is this gigantic megalopolis that stretches south and north. And at the time, Cairo didn't go all the way south. So Fustat and Cairo were separate places. So they lived in Fustat. He describes where he lives as a Shabbat's journey from the imperial palace. You can move about a mile outside of city boundaries on Shabbat according to Jewish law. So we know he's within a mile, but these are very different places at the time. So they settle in Fustat. This is the interior of the Maimonides Synagogue in Cairo, which is, Fustat. The whole area is Cairo now. This was restored in the late 2000s, was going to reopen in the 2010s. There was controversy because, of course, there was controversy. And then the Arab Spring happened and whatever else. But Maimonides is known to have studied in this synagogue. So it is called the Maimonides Synagogue. In Egypt, not long after arriving, he leads an effort to ransom Jewish captives from Crusaders in Bilbais, which is southeastern Nile Delta. His involvement in this is memorialized in a number of documents and may have resulted in his selection as Nagid. So Nagid is essentially the interface between the Jewish community and Muslim leadership. Important to know is that the Nagid is the interface between rabbinic Jews, so what we recognize as mainstream Judaism as it develops down to today, and some of the quote unquote heretical versions of Judaism. So Karaite Jews are also represented by the Nagid. His role in ransoming people may have led to his selection as Nagid. He's replaced 2 years later. And constantly in conflict with his successor, eventually replacing his successor in 1195, so serves twice, once in his early 30s and again in his 50s. Before he becomes Nagid in 1171, family sends his younger brother David to Sudan with family funds to grow the family's wealth. David finds nothing suitable in Sudan, heads for India, is drowned at sea, the money is gone. Maimonides starts working as a physician, right? So if you're not kind of familiar with how medical science worked in the 12th century, medicine, philosophy, astronomy, astronomy/astrology, physics, geometry, all the other forms of math were all considered philosophy. So when you studied Greek philosophy, you studied all of these subjects. So you were qualified to be a doctor. Maimonides starts working as a physician based on Greek medicine, and he gains a reputation for being a particularly good healer. He gains a reputation for experimentation, so he doesn't just take what Galen, the ancient Greek physician, had to say. He actually tests some of the theories, and he describes things we recognize today as allergies and asthma and some other disorders. And as physician, he eventually becomes a physician to the royal family in Egypt. So we'll get to that in a little bit. But to kind of put a point on what his life is like, by age 35, he has studied Jewish law and Greek philosophy and science, gone into exile, wandered most of the Mediterranean, may have undergone forced conversion. We'll come back to this. This is an interesting biographical point. Lost his brother, lost his family finances, rescued Jews, ransomed Jews from captivity with crusaders, been named the leader of Egyptian Judaism in his early 30s, and then loses the position, becomes a physician, writes and publishes a commentary on the Mishnah. So a major rabbinic document he's written a commentary on. And somehow he becomes a rabbi during all of this. Most of Maimonides' writings that we have are in Arabic. He wrote only a very few things in Hebrew. His commentary on the Mishnah is actually in Arabic and gets translated into Hebrew. So in all of this busyness, he actually does have a lot of biographical stuff. He writes letters, and we still have a lot of the letters, because by the time you get to the 12th century, people have started to save correspondence from major rabbis. And so we have correspondence from Maimonides, including some things that were written in his hand, or at least were signed in his hand, that were found in the Cairo Geniza. We'll talk about what that is in a second. But because this is Texts on Tuesday, we don't want to go too far without reading a text. So here's a text. This is part of a letter that was found in the Cairo Geniza with Maimonides describing losing his brother. And he says, "The greatest misfortune that has befallen me during my entire life, worse than anything else, was the demise of the saint, may his memory be blessed, who drowned in the Indian Sea, carrying much money belonging to me, to him, and to others, and left with a little daughter and a widow. On the day I received that terrible news, I fell ill and remained in bed for about a year, suffering from a sore boil, fever, and depression, and was almost given up. About 8 years have passed, but I am still mourning and unable to accept consolation. And how should I console myself? He grew up on my knees, he was my brother, and he was my student." So David was his youngest brother. So as Maimonides learned, he taught David, right? So this is this intergenerational learning model that happens in wealthy families. So you can see Maimonides was deeply affected. This is a Maimonidean document that was found in the Geniza. This is a photograph of Solomon Schechter. So if you haven't heard of Solomon Schechter before, Solomon Schechter was a scholar at Cambridge University, was a rabbi, eventually became the head of the conservative Jewish movement in the United States in the early 1900s. But before that, he was, among other things, a linguist. And in the late 1800s, a couple of wealthy British women were told of a cache of documents in the Ben Ezra Synagogue in Cairo. And it's just, the Geniza is this, a Geniza literally means a hidden place. It's where documents that are no longer suitable for use, sacred documents no longer suitable for use, are stored. Torah scroll is worn out, you can put it in a Geniza. In a lot of congregations, you print out a Torah portion on a computer and it has one of the names of God from the Torah in it. You don't throw away the paper, you put it in a Geniza. So if you were to go into Addis, Israel, off of Connecticut Avenue, and you went into their library, which is on the first floor. They call it their Beit Midrash. It's a library. They have 2 trash cans, and one of them says, "For the Geniza." So they accumulate these papers and then actually stash them away, following this model. So Maimonides' documents were in the Geniza, and this is Solomon Schechter in an office at Cambridge University, right? You can kind of tell from the windows, this is not Cairo. These piles of documents all around him are the papyri and the parchment that came out of the Cairo Geniza, out of this attic of a synagogue. And we found there's all kinds of really fascinating documents in the Geniza, including the first Dead Sea Scroll found was actually found in the Cairo Geniza, not at the Dead Sea. but including Maimonides' correspondence and this letter in particular. So Maimonides never moves again. He lives in Fustat for the rest of his life. In 1880, after about 10 more years of work after his commentary on the Mishnah, he completes the Mishna Torah, which is a code of Jewish law that was much more than a code of Jewish law, and we'll talk about this later. It is also his only major written work in Hebrew. Around 1190, he completes what in Hebrew is called Moreh Nevuchim, the Guide of the Perplexed, or Guide for the Perplexed, or Guide to the Perplexed. The same preposition means a number of different things in Hebrew, and all of these are accurate for that work. And it's okay if you're confused now too. As a physician, he becomes personal physician to the Ayyubid Empire's Grand Vizier Al-Qadi Al-Fadl. Al-Qadi just means judge, so this is actually the guy's name, is Al-Fadl. And then to Saladin, as in the Saladin who fought the Crusaders, that Saladin. And after Saladin died, remained in the employment of the Ayyubid dynasty. So until Maimonides dies, he's the family physician for the royal family. Maimonides publishes medical treatises, consults with Jewish communities far and wide, writes advisory correspondence, and then halachic legal response to questions about Jewish law. There are a number of pretty famous letters that this is relatively speaking famous, pretty famous letters that he wrote, including a letter to Yemen. There's a Jewish community in Yemen. He gives them some advice on how to deal with some messianic figures that have popped up in their community. A letter on martyrdom, which we'll look at some of later. His letter to Samuel ibn Tibbon, who is the translator for a number of Maimonides documents, bringing them from Arabic into Hebrew. The long and short of it is Samuel ibn Tibbon says, I got some questions, can I come visit you and we can kind of hash them out? Maimonides says, you would not believe my schedule. So this is the you would not believe my schedule text. We don't have Samuel ibn Tibbon's original letter. What we have is Maimonides' response. And Ibn Tibbon has apparently written and said, I'd like to come visit you in Cairo. I have some questions about some of the science that you talk about. There are some ambiguities in the translation, and can you answer the questions so that I can kind of get it figured out? Writing like this is not helping me. And the letter kind of opens with a memorial statement about Samuel ibn Tibbon's father, and then says, with respect to your wish to come to me, I cannot but say how greatly your visit would delight me. Yet I must advise you not to expose yourself to the perils of the voyage. Do not expect to be able to confer with me on any scientific subject for even an hour, either by day or by night, for the following is my daily occupation. I reside at Misr, and the Sultan resides at Kahira. So Misr is an earlier Arabic name for Fustat. Kahira is Cairo. So I reside at Misr, the Sultan resides at Kahira, 2 Sabbath days journey distant. So too far to walk on Shabbat. My duties to the Sultan are very heavy. I'm obliged to visit him every day early in the morning, as well as his children and harem members. I'm kind of plugging things in so we're not reading, too many gripes in a row. If nothing unusual happens, I do not return to Fustat until the afternoon. I find the antechambers filled with people, a mixed multitude who await the time of my return. Then I attend to my various patients until 2 hours and more into the night. And when night falls, I am so exhausted I can scarcely speak. In consequence, no Israelite can have any private interview with me except on the Sabbath. On that day, the whole congregation, or at least the majority of the members, come to me after the morning service. So Maimonides is basically saying, I don't get a day off. I don't have time to talk to you. I'm really, really worn out. These people are wearing me out, but I keep doing this work. So by now, so this is September 1199. By now, Maimonides is both court physician and Nagid. So he is the representative of the Jewish community to the Sultan. And so he has a community level position as well. So he works on Shabbat. To the extent that this is work, he works on Shabbat. So how did he get his scholarly writing done? No sleep? Yes. There is speculation that really he was so overworked that maybe he died earlier than he could have otherwise. He died around age 69. Again, guessing based on the year of his birth, which we're not 100% sure on. His major works, the Mishnah Torah and the Guide of the Perplexed, produce multiple controversies that begin in his lifetime and continue for over a century after he dies. The Mishnah Torah's goal was in many respects to supplant the main rabbinic texts. You can imagine how people wouldn't be particularly fond of having their jobs replaced. And so there was opposition to that. And the Mishnah Torah reorganizes the entire scheme of Jewish law. So people didn't even like that things were rearranged. The Guide of the Perplexed was so Aristotelian that it really surprised European Jewish scholars. So the scholars who lived in France and Germany were not pleased. Scholars who lived in North Africa or Spain, this wasn't surprising to them. They'd been studying Islamic philosophy a long time. Not a big deal to them. In North Africa, there's eventually some controversy dealing with Jewish mysticism as well. It's a testament to the power of his scholarship that despite the fact that there was 100 years of controversy over whether people should accept his work, everybody studies Rambam in yeshiva now. So he won in a sense. And both supporters and opponents were excommunicating each other in Jewish communities based on whether they agreed with or disagreed with Maimonides' work. And he dies in December 12th, 1204 in Fustat, right? So he never leaves Fustat. His body is eventually transported to Tiberias in Israel. So his remains are reportedly still in the land of Israel someplace. So before we kind of move on to really kind of substantively looking at Maimonides' works, because it's texts on Tuesday, not biographical sketches on Tuesday. Does anybody have questions, need me to restate something that I maybe said too fast? I'm prone to do that. Joyce.
Yeah, I just have a little picky question.
Mm-hmm.
Said the Sultan lived 2 days away from him, but he visited in the morning. I didn't understand how that worked.
Okay, so right, we're talking about this 2 Sabbath days journey distant. So traditional Jewish law, so halakha, has a limit on how far you're allowed to travel outside of an established town on Shabbat. So what he's saying is, I can't go there on Shabbat because it's double the distance I'm allowed to travel on Shabbat.
Okay.
So it's not that it takes 2 Shabbats to get there.
Okay.
It's my mileage is limited and I can't go there.
Got it. Thank you. Oh, and you were going to explain about the Muslim. Is that farther down?
About
conversion? Conversion?
Yes, so that is actually farther down.
Okay.
We're gonna look in some amount of detail at his letter, his epistle on martyrdom, his letter on martyrdom, because biographical detail is actually important, and it's important right away in the letter.
Got it.
In addition to being overworked as a physician and as the community leader, did he have a family life? Is there any information about that?
He had a couple of sons. There's not a ton of biographical material that people have really looked at closely. I will confess to not having gotten through, where is it? So this is the most recent, it's hard to read probably. This says Maimonides, Life and Thought. This is from 2014. This actually won the National Jewish Book Award. This is the most recent biography, and it is an intellectual biography primarily. And I will confess to not having spent a lot of time on the chapter called Moses the Man, because there's a bunch of other stuff to read about his other works. So he did have children. There are people who continue to this day to be descended from Maimonides. So he had some kind of a family life, but he just didn't gripe about that. Other questions? Joyce?
Well, I was just thinking there's at least one medical center that's named after. I mean, there's a lot of things named after him here, I guess.
Yeah, and most of the things, so there are kinds of two things named after him in the United States. One are hospitals and doctors' offices and sometimes medical schools or medical chairs. And then the other one is you will find Maimonides synagogues kind of here and there. So yeah, Moses Maimonides Medical Center in New York, but you'll also see Maimonides Academy and Maimonides Beit Knesset, particularly in Sephardic communities, tend to name things after Maimonides.
Interesting.
There is also the Rambam Hospital in Haifa.
And the Rambam Hospital. Well, there's more things named after Maimonides in Haifa, in Israel, than in the US, because most American non-Jews would go, who is Maimonides? Unless they accidentally took a class on medieval philosophy and ended up studying Maimonides. Okay, so if you know nothing else, if I wanted you, this is the section where I go, if I wanted you to walk away with nothing else about Maimonides, here's what I would want you to walk away with. And this is where I make the argument that he's an anthropological, he is a theological anthropologist, not an anthropological theologian. Most of his work is fundamentally practical in nature. He's a doctor. He's a community leader. We think of him as a scholar because that's our primary interaction, particularly as humanistic Jews, is looking at, oh, the guide of the perplexed, he's kind of skeptical, he's kind of rational, maybe he's a forebear of some kind. That wasn't his day-to-day life, as much as being a doctor was part of his day-to-day life, and hearing community gripes was his day-to-day life. And his letter on martyrdom is really a great example of how his life ties into the things he says. So the epistle on martyrdom, Igeret Hashmad, which literally means the letter on apostasy, letter on martyrdom, Shmad means destruction, or sometimes the Ma'amar, Kiddush Hashem, statement on sanctification, divine name, is from 1163. So this is Maimonides, and he's not 30 yet. He gets a letter from an acquaintance. And here's how he starts the letter. This is the beginning of this letter. A contemporary of mine inquired regarding this persecution. He had a friend still in Spain under the Almohads. Regarding this persecution in which he is forced to confess that that man, Muhammad, he just calls Muhammad that man is God's messenger and that he is a true prophet. He addressed this query to one whom he calls sage and was not touched by the tribulations of most of the Jewish communities in this violence. And he wished to learn whether he should make the confession in order not to die, though his children will be lost among the Gentiles, or should he die and not acknowledge what he demands. This is literally what the text says. I think he means what is demanded. Seeing that in this way, he does what he is required by the Torah of Moses, and that the confession leads to the relinquishment of all the commandments. Since I'm well informed regarding this issue and I'm not ignorant of it as this man is, I think it is proper to cite something of the gist of what he said and omit the rest. So this is the start of the letter. Maimonides is saying, somebody from Spain where I used to live wrote me a letter saying, I think I'm going to be forced to choose whether I confess faith in Islam or get the death penalty. If I confess, is that okay? What does it mean for me to do that? Or should I simply allow myself to be killed? Should I be martyred? And the scholar that he wrote to answered and said, well, the matter is very simple. Even if you pretend to believe what you're saying and then keep Jewish law in private, you are a Gentile. And so your only option is to submit to martyrdom. And Maimonides reads this answer and says, well, this is foolish. And this is where the biographical detail comes in. Based on some of what he says in this letter, based on the outcome that he gives in this letter, there are people who suggest that he was forced to confess faith in Islam and is therefore saying that he followed the advice he gives in the letter. His advice in the letter is ultimately get out of Dodge. So there's speculation that maybe he really did confess faith in Islam. There's no proof of it. He never says he did. There's no documentation to that effect. It's speculation. Since I am well informed regarding this issue and not ignorant of it, and he's very plain, this other person that was asked, this other rabbi, has been untouched by this persecution, so from where does he speak? I, however, left home and wandered the Mediterranean for almost 20 years before settling down someplace. I know what this is. And Maimonides does this thing, so he says, since I'm well informed regarding this issue, not ignorant, to cite something of the gist and omit the rest. He then goes on for about 7 pages to explain all of the things this guy got wrong without naming him. So he doesn't really just focus on the rest. He really does kind of come out and say, this guy's foolish. Unimpressed by the response his acquaintance received, says, so when I looked further into his remarks, I noted that he said the following: whoever utters that confession is a Gentile, though he fulfills the entire law publicly and privately. You could keep kosher, you could pray 3 times a day in the synagogue, you could study Torah, you could follow Jewish business law, you could do all of the things that you're supposed to do, but having given that confession, you are now no longer a Jew, is what this original scholar said. This clear-headed man, this is like in Julius Caesar where Brutus says, and Brutus, when Anthony says, and Brutus is an honorable man. This clear-headed man evidently sees no difference between one who does not observe the Sabbath out of fear of the sword and one who does not observe it because he does not wish to. This interpretation, again, does not discriminate between one who bowed to the idol and the temple because he is a heretic and wants to defile God's name, and one who comes to a house of worship in order to behave like someone zealous, but does not utter or say a word that is in any way contrary to our religion, yet he must of necessity go to that house. In other words, this person doesn't recognize the difference between feeling under threat of your life and feeling compelled to do something and actually being willing to do it. And for Maimonides, that's the difference. It is common knowledge that in the course of a persecution, Rabbi Meir was arrested. Some who knew him said, "You're Meir, aren't you?" And he replied, "I'm not." Pointing to him, they ordered, "Eat this if you are not Jewish." He responded, "I shall eat it," and pretended he was eating. In the view of this modest person who knows the true meaning of Torah, this is medieval rabbi sarcasm, Rabbi Meir is undoubtedly a Gentile, for his responsum so rules. He who acts openly as a Gentile, though secretly he behaves as a Jew, is a Gentile. So this is Maimonides saying this rule doesn't work. That this is not how the vicissitudes of being persecuted actually goes. So his eventual answer, and he has like a 5-part answer, it's a long letter, says, if the ruler or the government is forcing conversion for its amusement, as long as they don't require you to murder somebody, commit incest, or commit idolatry, you can decide whether to comply. So you have the choice. Do I want to follow along or do I want to be martyred? If the government is forcing conversion to cause Jews to sin, you again have to decide. Is it a time of persecution? If it is, you have to undergo martyrdom. If not, you can sin in private, but if they're going to force you to do something in public, you have to surrender your life. So it seems like Maimonides isn't giving a better answer. Oh, if nobody's watching, well, fine, whatever. If it's in public, well, you have to surrender your life. If they're going to require you murder, incest, or idolatry, well, you can't do that. But Maimonides does something interesting. Maimonides says, but we can't punish you for this. So there can be no punishment. The person should aim to live life as much in compliance with halakha as possible, but isn't considered to inherently be somebody who would transgress the law. Doesn't lose his status to testify as a witness, is not deemed to be a sinner. If actively persecuted, he needs to leave where he is. And if he can't leave because he's afraid of sailing or he's got business interests or family interests or whatever, you're still not deemed an intentional sinner, though Maimonides says you should view yourself as nearly so, and should do what you can to observe Jewish law in secret because your reward will be double because you're being persecuted. So Maimonides' answer, this is based on his experience. Okay, these are difficult decisions to make and you can't blame somebody for wanting to save their life. We can, however, say there are things you should and shouldn't do. And yet we're not going to track that person down and they don't need to submit themselves for punishment. We're not going to consider that person inherently a sinner. This is not somebody who's considered an apostate. This is not somebody who's considered to have left Judaism. This is somebody who's failed to follow some commandments, but continues to follow other ones. And then, you know, you should leave and go someplace where you can follow Jewish law. And if that means you have to leave your family behind to do it, well, you have to leave your family behind to do it. You know, remember that the earlier part of the letter says, should he confess, not die, though his children will be lost among the Gentiles. So Maimonides' point is, well, you can confess, not die, and then you need to leave. And if that leaves your family behind, well, you've left your family behind. So this is kind of Maimonides' life experience guiding an outcome, as opposed to a rabbi without life experience in this thing, kind of saying, oh, well, the rule is very simple, right? So this is the anthropological theologian or theological anthropologist. Maimonides is coming in on the side of the people more than he is on the theology that would seem to say on its own, you can't do any of this. So this is part of the distinction that I'm talking about between theology versus people and Maimonides as a practical thinker, right? He's answering questions about really difficult issues, and he's answering them in a way that will actually determine about 800 years of Jewish law on what you do when you're persecuted. So Maimonides' letter will be cited by rabbis in the Warsaw Ghetto and in the Łódź Ghetto who are asked, you know, do we have to do XYZ thing? They don't have these documents. They don't even have this document with them anymore, but they often know it well enough that they can say, well, this is what Maimonides said. And so here's what you should do or you shouldn't do, or what you can or can't do. And do as you think you need to. So this is an incredibly influential document. So questions on the letter on martyrdom, because we're going to move away from that document. So Roberto says, I understood his position against martyrdom was not so unique among rabbis in the Middle Ages. It was not so unique, but they got it mostly from him. So take that as you will. This is one of those things where Maimonides' position is very, very, very influential over the course of several hundred years. Michael, you've got a virtual hand up.
Yeah. So in the first item there about it for amusement, the things that you can never do are murder, incest, and idolatry.
Mm-hmm.
And I always thought, well, the key here was that Islam is not idolatry, because Islam, as Maimonides well understood, is perhaps even more rigidly monotheistic than Judaism. It's clearly not idolatry.
Right.
And so the question arises whether you become an apostate, but you're certainly not an idolater if you convert to Islam.
Right.
For Maimonides, who lived in the Muslim world, not in the Christian world, Christianity was idolatry.
Mm-hmm.
And so and I'll just point out one of the issues here, which enables him to do that, is that Islam is purely monotheistic and therefore not idolatry, even if you recognize Muhammad as the prophet.
Right. This takes on, he doesn't dwell on this murder, incest, or idolatry thing. So this takes on sort of the cast of, I'm supposed to cite the rule before I start talking about its application, which is a very law school way of talking. Sorry. This has the cast of, I got to tell you what the rule is first, and then we can discuss how it works. But the murder, incest, idolatry triad is just always part of the statement. In theory, you know, these rules don't derive initially from persecution by Christians or by Muslims. They derive from persecution by pagans. So the incest, idolatry, murder thing makes sense as a triad in rabbinic literature, and Maimonides is just saying, oh, if they're going to make you do X, well, you have to be martyred.
Yeah, but I understand, but my understanding is that if the person writing to him said, I'm being forced to take communion, I'm being forced to recognize the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, I believe Maimonides would have said, that's idolatry, you cannot do it.
So I would say it's unclear, in part because I don't have a written source to say, oh yeah, he would definitely think that that's idolatry. Although Maimonides is heavily dependent upon some Christian Aristotelian thought. So he's among the more tolerant. So I sort of wonder where he would fall out on that. His letter in this case doesn't actually mention anything about Christianity. So I don't have a great insight. So Myrna has down in the text, is this relevant? And if so, how would his rule apply to the Jew who becomes a capo in the concentration camps to save his own life? So this is not the letter of Maimonides that you would care about. There is, however, in the Mishnah Torah in particular, Maimonides talks about the rule of Mesirut, the idea of Moser, somebody who hands over, commits treason against Jews, and also of the Rodef, the pursuer, and Maimonides would be applying those rules to a capo in a concentration camp. So the balance for Maimonides would actually not be, would not necessarily be the epistole and martyrdom when you're dealing with a capo. It would be, are you functioning as a pursuer that you would be deserving of death if a Sanhedrin ruled over your case? And as a capo, are you going to be forced to do things that hand Jews over to non-Jews for undeserved punishment? So there's some relevance for the letter, but he's actually got a whole other set of rules that come out of rabbinic law that deal with kind of that contingency. Joyce, you have a hand up.
Yeah, I wondered if this might have influenced the conversos. That was, I guess, a couple hundred years later, right?
Yes. So this influences conversos in terms of their decisions on whether to claim to be Christian, right, to undergo conversion. It is also especially important afterward, when conversos and their descendants are leaving Spain and coming to places like Holland. So there's a large Jewish community in Amsterdam. Right? This is where Spinoza is from. His family fled Spain. There is this large community, and over the course of 150 years or so, it starts to accumulate people whose ancestors converted to Christianity in or around 1492, and then eventually leave for Holland because the nature of Spain's and Portugal, the nature of the Inquisition in those countries was that they believed in impure blood. So they thought there was such a thing as Jewish blood, and they never really accepted converso families. And so did you mean it? Did they mean it? What does it mean? These kinds of issues in the letter on martyrdom come up again in a big way for like a 150-year time frame in Holland in particular. Jack.
The last paragraph, last part of it, do what you can to observe Jewish law in secret because the reward is double.
Yes.
The reward in the afterlife, what reward is he talking about?
So this is an interesting question. And this is actually going to be a lot of the rest of the month. There seems to be a scholarly consensus that's at least emerged in the last 20 years that part of Maimonides' project is to separate Judaism from the idea that halakha, that Jewish law, is a system of merits and demerits that get you into heaven. And this is the way we often think about traditional Jewish law. Maimonides is actually trying to get people to think of it a different way. So Maimonides is sort of walking the line here. It is also early in his thought, so he may still be thinking of it as merits and demerits at this point. But yes, it is, merits and demerits for getting into the world to come. Michael.
Yeah, on the issue of whether he had ever converted to
Mm-hmm.
Islam, or I had thought, and maybe you can correct me, that at some point when he was, I guess, in North Africa, the issue came up of whether he had ever been a Muslim, because if he had, that would make him now an apostate from Islam, for which he would have to be executed. And my understanding was he argued that whatever happened was not a true conversion. Are you familiar with that?
Yeah. So this was actually not just Maimonides. This was a lot of people who moved to Egypt. There was eventually a leniency in Jewish law developed where they invalidated all of these forced conversions, like en masse. So had Maimonides converted in this way, he too would have been rolled up in this. We know that there were these forced conversions. We're not going to consider them as serious. We're not going to consider them as real. We're essentially undoing that. You're not apostates. You're members of the Jewish community.
I'm talking from the point of view of the Muslims. He became an apostate from Islam.
So the Muslims also had issues with these forced conversions, because where he went was a Muslim empire that still had dhimmi status and was also at war with the people that he had fled from. And so they were uninclined to accept these forced conversions. So both sides kind of said, no, we don't take these seriously. Saladin conquers Jerusalem, but he doesn't lay waste to the Jewish and Christian communities there in total. So this is just a more tolerant version of Islam that's willing to kind of leave well enough alone, and may speak to the prominence of the Jewish community in Fustat and Cairo at the time. Okay. So from here, we're going to look at the Mishna Torah. So the Mishna Torah is a code of Jewish law. It is not the first code of Jewish law, but it is the first genuinely organized and genuinely summative code of Jewish law. So before Maimonides, there are, how would I describe this? If you look in the back of a volume of Talmud, a traditional volume of Talmud, everything in Hebrew, whatever else, there are a couple of collections of work that look like they're more pages of Talmud. And they are not more pages of Talmud exactly. They are instead attempts to isolate out specific Talmudic discussions to kind of maybe give you an answer to specific questions. And they look like a page of Talmud because they've accumulated commentaries on either side over the years. And that is as close as anybody came in Judaism up until Maimonides to having a fixed code of Jewish law where you go, I want to know the answer to X. And you open the book and you look for an answer. Maimonides is the first person to say, I'm going to give you a book where you can open it up and look for the answer. And he was so concerned about it being universally accepted that he didn't write it in Arabic. He wrote it in Hebrew, writes everything else in Arabic. This he writes in Hebrew. And he knows he's doing something new. So if you were in one of our sessions on kind of the oral law and the Mishnah, you'll kind of remember that we talked about the problem of people losing track of what the law is. And so the Mishnah is written down in order to kind of preserve opinions as of the time that it's framed. And each subsequent rabbinic text is doing a similar thing. That's the theory that the rabbis are operating under. Maimonides says, again, we have this story. In our days, severe vicissitudes prevail and all feel the pressure of hard times. We're forgetting Jewish law. Hence, the commentaries of the Geonim and the compilations of the laws and responses, which they took care to make clear, having in our times become hard to understand so that only a few individuals properly comprehend them. Only rabbis can understand what these other rabbis are saying, and this is a problem. Needless to add that such is the case in regard to the Talmud itself, the Babylonian as well as the Palestinian, the Sifra, the Sifrei, and the Tosefta. So the Talmuds, the legal and other works, these are kind of running argumentative commentaries. The Sifra and the Sifrei are biblical commentaries on Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Actually just Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, but he also probably means the one on Exodus as well. The Tosefta, which is sort of an add-on to the Mishnah and the Talmud, all of which works require for their comprehension a broad mind, a wise soul, and considerable study, and then one can learn from them the correct practices to what is forbidden or permitted and the other rules of the Torah. You got to spend years and years and years studying, and you need to know so much in order to be able to begin to figure out what Jewish law is based on these books. On these grounds, everything's too hard to learn. I bestirred myself and intently studied all these works, with the view of putting together the results obtained from them in regard to what is forbidden or permitted, clean or unclean, and the other rules of the Torah, all in plain language and terse style, so that thus the entire oral law might become systematically known to all without citing difficulties in solutions or differences of view, but consisting of statements clear and convincing and in accordance with the conclusions drawn from all these compilations and commentaries, so that no other work should be needed for ascertaining any of the laws of Israel. I have written a thing that lets you open the book, find your topic, find the answer to your question. Is it okay to X? How am I supposed to do repentance on the high holidays? He's got an entire section called the laws of repentance. Like Google. Like Google, yeah. So he says, I've read everything. I've read all of this stuff, and I've got the answers for you. I've got the answers for you. I've got them in this book. I'm not going to bother you with citing the different opinions, right? So these prior legal codes, just repeated Talmudic arguments. They didn't give you the answer. Don't worry about it. I'm not going to give you the differences of opinion. I've got the answer. It's right here. My book. Just read my book. You don't need to read anything else. You don't need to study Talmud. You don't need to spend all of your time in yeshiva. I've got the answer. As long as you can read fairly basic Hebrew, I've got your answer right here. Don't worry about the Talmud. In fact, he's so confident that he has the answer, he rarely cites a source and doesn't cite the disputes, which therefore makes every other rabbi in the world really mad. So he knows what he's doing. He is essentially trying to say, let's dispense with this. I have the answers. How many questions are in the Passover Seder? 5, except we don't say one of them. What should the Haggadah be? His laws on Passover includes the text of a Haggadah. This is what should be in your Haggadah. I've got it for you. Here it is. Don't worry. I've got you covered. If you can read Hebrew, you can read this. So this is really what Maimonides is set out to do, and it is unlike anything that came before it. Nothing that came before is intended for you to actually be able to use it. Nothing that came before is supposed to give you the answer. It's supposed to preserve the disputes so that you can then reason your way to an answer. Larry, you have a hand up.
Well, Rabbi, enlighten me. So he seems so logical in the letter on martyrdom and this. I got this letter, I checked with that guy, but my experience supersedes him. And so from my experience, this and this, and in this case, this, and in that case, that. Now here's the Mishnah, do the same thing, the whole Torah. Now, I just don't, I can't, he seems so modern, so I feel close to him. Obviously, he's more capable than I, but I don't see how anyone could get clear answers out of the Mishnah from the little sample that you gave us. And even if you could figure out a logically consistent story, that Mishnah is so complex, you'd have to be in error, at least in some places. That's just not clear. And
Yeah.
So I'm saying, how did he do this? This is amazing.
How did he do this? So he studied the Mishnah and all the other stuff. He did really kind of study all of it. And he said, oh, well, the answer here should be this, and the answer here should be that, and the answer there should be this, and the answer over there should be this other thing. And he's got, in addition to the Mishnah and the Talmud and all these other documents, he has letters from other rabbis making decisions. By this time, Rashi's commentary on the Talmud is available. So he's got a lot of documents that he's worked from to reach conclusions that he puts into this code of Jewish law. And his idea is, you don't really need to know all of that stuff to be able to follow the rules. The purpose of the oral law was to make it so that we would know what to do, and it's all gotten confused. So let's stop that, and let's instead, here's the rules. He doesn't really do a good job of explaining what you do when there's a conflict, right? So Roberto said, I don't think he meant to eliminate the Mishnah and the Talmud for intellectual study, but only for the intent to use it as a basis for a legal decision. Probably so, right? Like at a certain people are still going to study rabbinic texts, and that's fine, but the idea behind the oral Torah, as Maimonides sees it, is that you would know what you were supposed to do when you read the Torah and it didn't make any sense. And yet somehow we've gotten so removed from it because people aren't writing down the rules, they're writing down the disputes. And they're not even writing down the disputes in ways that you can navigate the disputes, because he actually acknowledges elsewhere in this introduction to the Mishnah Torah, he says, the languages weren't even understandable in their day. You had to be taught the languages. And it's the Aramaic of the Babylonian Talmud is not good Aramaic. It is very clearly shorthand technical jargon. It is not the Aramaic that people spoke on the street. So you had to learn their Aramaic even to be able to read this document. Even if you spoke Aramaic, you needed help. So his point is, it's too confusing. I'm going to give you the answers by studying all of it and telling you. So Larry says, is it possible he made a mistake? The answer is very, very possible. So this is book 1 of 7 books I have that is the Hebrew version of the Mishnah Torah. I don't have a standard rabbinic printing. I cheated. I got the one that Rabbi Adin Steinsaltz wrote a commentary on. So this is the actual Mishnah Torah, the bigger text. Steinsaltz's commentary, kind of modern Hebrew gloss, is over here. On the bottom is a commentary written by a scholar called the Ra'avad. The Ra'avad was another scholar who was very offended by what Maimonides did and set out to criticize the Mishnah Torah, and does so at every possible turn as a commentary on the Mishnah Torah. And among the things he says is, well, you know, in Eastern Europe, our custom is, and he points out places where Maimonides gets confused in his reading of the Talmud, and is very happy to point it out. So there's a section in Maimonides' discussion of how you do teshuvah, of how you do repentance, where the Ra'avad says, no, Maimonides got three things wrong, and he combines them into one, and here's what the actual three things are, and the law is much more lenient than he says. So Maimonides definitely made mistakes. We can see Maimonides made mistakes, because when you read that part of the Ra'avad's thing and you go look at the Talmud, you realize Maimonides did this wrong. So Maimonides didn't get it all right. Michael, you have a virtual hand up.
Yeah, in terms of, I always thought that, I said Maimonides read all of these sources, but I thought that he also was reflecting what he had learned from his own teachers. In other words, which of the three Talmudic answers was the right one. You just learn that from the rabbinic tradition, and that would be, I always thought, from his own teachers, at least to some extent.
So to some extent, he's deciding that what his practice is, which he learned from his teachers, is the right answer. In the case where the Ra'avad's criticizing him, you can really see that Maimonides didn't read the text right. And there are a number of places where that's the case. So Maimonides' practice actually reflects, what's in the Mishnah Torah reflects what Maimonides thinks practice should be, and sometimes that reflects Spanish practice, and not even necessarily Moroccan practice, let alone Italian practice or French practice or Provençal practice or Portuguese practice, or, right? There's all sorts of different versions of Jewish custom that informs Jewish law, and he's kind of making decisions that sometimes don't fit for everybody in the world. He just thinks they do. Okay, so this is Maimonides acknowledging I'm doing something new, but it's fundamentally practical, right? All in plain language and terse style. I want you to be able to read this, and it says, here's what you do, here's what you do, here's what you do, here's what you do. What he's doing is also, and he doesn't say this, an effort at reorganizing how Judaism works. So we think of the Guide of the Perplexed. We're told that the Guide of the Perplexed is him taking Aristotelian philosophy and putting a Jewish veneer on it. That's one take on it. But stopping short on what he adopts from Aristotelian philosophy when he can't accept the answer. Maybe that's true, maybe that's not. But what's really instructive is not necessarily the Guide of the Perplexed. What's instructive is the Mishnah Torah. So he actually incorporates Greek astronomy and science into Jewish law. He codifies Greek astronomy into Jewish law. Part of his commandments are, you have to love God, and you have to believe that God is the first cause, and nothing could exist without God, but God can exist without everything else existing. And also, you have to believe that there are 8 firmaments, actually 9 firmaments, that follow this order. As for the spheres, they are called heaven and firmament and heavenly abode and vessels. He's naming the biblical names for the heavens. And there are 9 spheres. The nearest is the sphere of the moon, and the one above that is the sphere in which is the body of Mercury. And the one above that contains Venus, and the one above that has the sun, and the one above that has Mars, and the one above that has Jupiter, and the one above that has Saturn, and the one above that has all the rest of the stars that appear in the firmament, and the final one is the sphere that moves from east to west all throughout the day. So think of these things as like candy shells going out in order, and the farthest one out turns and moves everything else. So Maimonides recognizes a universe in motion. He's directly quoting Ptolemy's Almagest, which is an astronomical work from the 2nd century CE. This is not in the Talmud. This is not in any code of Jewish law. This is Maimonides saying in the Mishnah Torah, if you love God, Sefer Ahava, this is part of loving God, is understanding that this diagram is how the universe is. It's Greek science. This isn't something from the ancient Near East. This is something that came to him in Arabic because it was preserved in Arabic, but it's not the Arabs who wrote this, it's the Greeks. And he's taken Greek science and actually put it into, quite literally, this book. I translated this from here today. It's in there. So it's easy to think, oh, you know, he has limits, and he does have limits. But he's actually telling Jews, this is the way your universe works. And the way your universe works is not the biblical way the universe works. It's the Greek way. And he's aware he's doing this. I mean, he obviously is aware. The Talmud does not talk about, 9 firmaments that all fit together and the earth is in the middle. You can even see the Almagest kind of imagines things as kind of gears. And gears, and here's the moon. And this is the model of the universe he says is you're supposed to believe. Because this is how you love God, is to understand the universe. And to understand the universe, to love God, to understand the universe, this is the universe. This is it. This model. So the innovations here, there's a bunch. So he reorders the topics of Jewish law. He does not follow the order of the Mishnah. He says, there's rules about loving God, I'm going to put them here. There's rules about repentance, I'm going to put them here. There's rules about Passover, I'm going to put them here. There's rules about what kings are supposed to do, I'm going to put them here. We don't have a systematic discussion of government in the Talmud, but we do in Maimonides. This is how you deal with tefillin. This is how you do with writing a Torah scroll. All consolidated down in ways that they never really were before. It doesn't follow the organization of the Talmud or anything else. He's rationalized this system. He's saying belief is commanded. He's codifying things by giving you summaries, quick statements of what you're supposed to do instead of this source says this source says this source says that. We got to figure it out. The oral Torah was never summarized like this. It wasn't supposed to be, right? So if you read some of these earlier documents from Maimonides, they basically make it clear you're not supposed to do what Maimonides did. Science is fundamental to Torah. You can't understand, you can't love God without seeing the universe the way Ptolemy saw the universe. So he understands what he's doing is reworking all of Judaism. And he doesn't get fixated in Sefer Ahava, so this is the first big chunk of the Mishnah Torah. So fundamental is loving God first, and then you can observe the rest of the Torah. This is the thing he thinks is fundamental, not fear of punishment, not repentance, not redemption in the world to come, but loving God. That's what makes for proper Jewish practice, and things will fall out from that. So it's a very rationalized approach. I don't think I have another slide. I do have another slide. So why this approach? Maimonides' goal is to separate religion from thought of reward or punishment, focus it. So this is actually not an ancient text. This is a modern text. This is an excerpt of a book review of the biography. Albert Hall opens by explaining that Maimonides' career can be characterized by attempts to bring two major revolutions. One is the realm of Jewish legal study. First attempt to encompass all of Jewish law in one work. Maimonides also transforms our understanding of religious consciousness, moving us away from religion aiming at God's favor and toward the idea that God acts through nature rather than through disruptions in the customary course of events. These are tied together as Albert Hall presents them because Maimonides structured the Mishna Torah according to philosophical principles that drove his attempt to change the worldview of Judaism. Much of the book investigates the meaning behind these two revolutions and explains the ways in which Maimonides attempted to bring them about, giving a rich portrayal of man as well as the work. So this is Maimonides at work. He's using Greek philosophy to reorganize Judaism. The supreme irony of this is this book, which people rejected because it had short, plain statements, is now used by modern Orthodox rabbis to figure out what the rules should be, so they can find sources to then use this as a jumping off point for the exact kinds of discussions that Maimonides was trying to help people not have by giving them rules in the first place. So he might be very surprised by how this got used. Okay, so I don't know about the other hands, but Roberto, I know your hand is new, but you'll have to unmute. There you go.
All right. Yeah. Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yes.
Hi. You just mentioned the use of the Mishnah Torah being part of rabbinical studies today, right? So it's part of the, let's say, the library, right, together with the real Torah and Talmud and all that.
Mm-hmm.
So how is that reconciliation with all those you just mentioned, this little kind of peculiarity, right? I don't know how characteristic that kind of Ptolemaic view of the universe and those things, how they just skip those parts or they use that as a means for discussion. How is that fitting into the whole rabbinical teaching today?
So they use it as a stopping off point for discussion. In modern orthodoxy, right, the sort of Torah umada, the Torah and science approach, they think science is important. They recognize that Maimonides doesn't actually have it fully right, but they also kind of point out that Maimonides sort of has some stuff right? The universe is in motion. It's not earth-centered, but it's, they recognize the value of science. They don't view Maimonides' statements as to what the law is as the final word. It's a jumping off point for further inquiry, because Maimonides' code is not the last code. So Maimonides' code is the first code. And we get subsequent codes of Jewish law, and the subsequent codes of Jewish law don't try to tell you how the universe is organized. Maimonides does, because Maimonides has a different project. But what's kind of fascinating about it is Orthodox Jews, even very, very Orthodox Jews, who will never read the Guide of the Perplexed, absolutely read this. Absolutely read the Mishnah Torah. And they don't really have time for the Guide of the Perplexed. The exception to this, and you'll be surprised, is Chabad. So if you go on to Chabad.org, you will find the entire Mishnah Torah translated. You will find chunks of the Guide of the Perplexed translated, because the last Lubavitcher Rebbe was educated as an engineer and maybe fancied himself as a little bit of a modern day Maimonides. And so Maimonides becomes very important in Hasidic, in Chabad, right? Chabad Lubavitch, the way their Judaism gets structured. So Rambam is studied. The Guide of the Perplexed is studied along with some other texts that in a lot of other yeshivas, you don't study those. Jack.
So this was an extraordinarily ambitious project. Is he to be understood as an idiosyncratic genius, or are there currents in contemporary Islam, for example, that helped kind of push him in the direction that we see here?
To some extent, there are currents in Islam. It's useful, so to the extent to which people are familiar with Islam, I think there's a very good argument to be made that Islam is a lot more like Judaism than Christianity is. That Islam has all of these external works that are interpreting the Quran, these codes of law, these interpretive works, right, the Hadith, all of this external stuff that when people run around in American society quoting the Quran, they don't know about all the other stuff. Just like when they run around quoting the Torah, they don't know about all the other stuff that makes these texts different from what they seem to be on their face. So there are intellectual currents with philosophy, with Hadith, with all of these other things that he's writing a little bit. But the idea of completely transforming Judaism away from the merit-demerit system is pretty new to him and isn't actually successful, right? This is the part of his plan that doesn't work is, Orthodox Jews today still, they'll say, oh, I don't have a demerit, there's not a real merit and demerit system, but actually mentally sometimes there kind of is. So he's writing intellectual currents, but where they take Islam, they don't take Islam to where Maimonides wants to try to take Judaism. To a certain extent, my brain is slightly dusty on this because it's been 21 years since I sat in an Islamic philosophy classroom, so things are slightly fuzzy. But I do recall that Islam doesn't change that much under Greek philosophy in the way that Maimonides is trying to change Judaism. Michael.
Just to follow up on that, maybe to restore your 21 years, Maimonides was born in the same city as Ibn Rushd, the great Islamic rationalist philosopher who's known in the West as Averroes. And he's the one who, basically at the same time, was trying to see Islam from an Aristotelian point of view. Now, he might not have been as revolutionary in what he was trying to do as Maimonides, but clearly this was what was going on in the Islamic world that Maimonides lived in. And like I said, they were born in the same city, although Maimonides had to flee, before he, but presumably he was aware and knew exactly, really understood this movement toward Greek rationalist thinking in Islam.
Oh yeah, and that's why. So I mentioned earlier when Guide of the Perplexed appears, there are a lot of European rabbis who are scandalized, but the rabbis in Egypt and the rabbis in Morocco and the rabbis in Spain are not, because they've been reading Averroes too. They're not surprised by anything Maimonides says. It's sort of to them, oh, well, this is how this all works. But they didn't necessarily see the program that Maimonides had, right? That's sort of the result of more time and more recognition of what's happening. So Howard asks, have any of his ideas regarding medicine stood the test of time? Yes. Not everything, obviously, because he's working with Greek philosophy. So he's working with Galen as his sort of starting point for medicine. However, some of his, not treatment for the etiology of asthma and allergies, but the sort of symptom treatment have stood up. His general guide toward moderation in diet, moderation in habits, staying active, some of these things, they still stand up. Now, he's not the only person who said them, but those have stood the test of time. There is actually, I believe he's passed away, but there is a doctor named Fred Posner who has written a book on Maimonides and medicine. So he's actually made a study of Maimonides and his medical work and his halachic work and how those all fit together and how they do or don't match up with modern medical science. And Posner has actually written a couple of different books about kind of Jewish law and medicine, not from an ethics standpoint, but from a, what are these prescriptions that they're writing and what are the herbs and do they do anything and whatever else. So there's actually a guy who just spent a lot of his, I have to assume his retirement, researching halacha and researching Maimonides and researching medicine and figuring out how it all works together or if it does still work together. So that's actually worth looking at. I have one of his books hanging around somewhere, I think. And that particular one is a translation of a German work that he then edited. Other questions? I see virtual hands, but I don't know whose virtual hand is a real virtual hand. No questions. So everybody's just like mentally tired at this point.
We
Oh,
have 3 more weeks to ask.
Yeah, you have 3 more weeks to ask. That's right. Although we'll be looking at Guide of the Perplexed a bit. So maybe you'll be too confused by the time we've done that to be able to ask. I don't know. A lot of what we'll look at will be Guide of the Perplexed. Not all of it, because of course, Greek philosophy is part of Jewish law for him, which is a pretty interesting phenomenon when you drill down into it. It's like somebody saying quantum physics belongs in the Torah. Actually, Chabad tries to do that. I shouldn't say that they don't try to do that. Chabad tries to do that. Okay. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording.
Thank you.